Super Tuesday is what stream days are now known as, right? Welcome everybody online and BSOP. It's good to be back with you guys. I missed you last month. Believe it or not, I really did miss you. I was in Japan translating for Mr. Kimura. I don't know if you guys have seen videos or coverage of that event. We'll have our own coverage coming out about that event, so if you missed it, you can kind of catch the high points from Mirai Live. All of that content will be free so that you guys can enjoy that, and I welcome and invite you guys to check that out because it was quite the experience. Want to just say hello to Kendall on the mic this evening.
Hi.
Hello, Kendall. Arthur on the decks back here, Mr. Ricardo on the detail, Junior on the main camera, and Lime on the audio. Without these guys, none of this would happen. So just give them a round of applause. Okay, and then online, I want to thank our Tier 1 members. Thank you guys for tuning in. Tier 2, hope you guys are digging the archive. I've gotten a lot of feedback from you guys, and I hope that that's serving its purpose and helping you master those techniques. Tier 3, all of that tertiary content in addition to our Q&As that we get to do together. I love you guys and value that very much, so I hope that that's all working out, okay? Theme for tonight. Kendall, what's the theme for tonight?
Growth perpetuation.
Growth perpetuation. Holy cow. So just before we dive into any fundamental knowledge, if I can get some feedback. Oh.
Ground rules.
Ground rules. Ground rules for you guys tuning in on the stream. All questions this evening funneled through Kendall need to pertain to the content that's being delivered here, okay? So it can't be like, oh, that's great, you're working on a spruce. How about that bald cypress? Yeah. Right, let's keep it to what we're doing here tonight. We ask that of you guys, and we'd appreciate it for all our Tier 3 members. Be disciplined, stay tight.
Yeah, and we can just keep our species-specific and situation-specific questions to the live Q&As, which are rocking.
Nice, nice. Yeah. The live Q&A has become quite robust, so stay focused, guys, okay? Growth perpetuation. So just asking you guys, what is happening right now? What is happening with your trees? What are you seeing? What is happening in the landscape? What is this magic that we call spring? What are you seeing? Growth. Growth. Holy cow. And for bonsai people, where we're trying to keep a tree tiny, growth is a stressful thing, right? It's a very stressful thing. Now, leading up to this discussion this evening, we've been talking first about energy generation and then strength distribution, okay? Now we're talking about strength perpetuation. Because we've had that opportunity, increasing daylight length, increasing temperatures, trees start metabolically functioning at a higher and higher rate, and all of a sudden what wasn't happening is now happening. And then if we didn't handle things correctly, or maybe we handled them really correctly, it's happening faster than any of us could have imagined. We're like, holy crap, right? One of my original instructors used to tell me about fertilization. He would say, the more you fertilize, the more you got to prune. Don't fertilize. Okay? Which is an approach. It is an approach, right? And it's definitely what I would say an antiquated sector of thought. The goal here is to give you guys the knowledge of how you fertilize, how you push growth, how you drive these things to happen, but then how you respond and handle the tree's response to all of the activity that you're giving. So, growth perpetuation, when we start talking about growth perpetuation, we are now entering that sort of last inkling of stored energy that's being pushed through the tree, okay? So we say in the winter or in the fall, trees are reaccumulating all of their energy and putting them into their vascular tissue. Come spring, increasing daylight length, increasing temperature, all of those stored sugars and carbohydrates are generating new solar panels to hopefully not only recuperate that energy, but expand on the ability to reaccumulate that energy, okay? But that's a quantifiable amount that is dictated by the size of this container because all of the nutrition and energy has to funnel through this uptake of water and nutrition, that water being the epicenter of 2 parts of that sugar and carbohydrate that's produced. Are you guys still with me? Yeah? Whew. That was a lot in a very short span of time. If you're with me, I'm impressed. Let's just talk about that for a minute. Okay, so when we talk about carbon dioxide plus water, via that vehicle that we love to talk about, which is photosynthesis, what we end up getting is C6H12O6. Very basic building block as a carbohydrate, and that then becomes broken down into usable forms of sugar, okay? So we're saying, listen, this water, that all comes from here. That's responsible for the hydrogen and the oxygen. Very, very interesting, right? The carbon comes off of our CO2. This oxygen is what's released, and we say trees contribute to the oxygen content in the atmosphere. Right there. That's where it happens. Okay? This stored energy that's stored in the vascular tissue and maybe the root system of pines, the vascular tissue of deciduous and elongating species, we've now run all of that out. That's been pushed out of that tree to generate more solar panels based on the security of increasing temperature, increasing daylight length, and the tree is getting to that point where you guys have seen this tree pinch not once, but twice now, right? Have you seen it twice or just once? Okay, so I've followed up.
No,
I don't know.
We pinched it.
We pinched it twice. So if you guys are not members of Mirai Live, the week after Todd did this stream here for BSOP, I pinched it a second time to show you guys working number 2. Okay? Now we're coming back and we're looking at number 3. And this is looking significantly different, is it not? Yeah, denser, fuller, more developed, more evolved. And that is that transition of strength from strong to medium to weak, which is the reason that we do pinch, okay, to transition that energy from strong to medium to weak in the refinement process of elongating species, okay? Now, this third piece of work that we're looking at here, we want to be handling this third pinching or third control of growth, knowing that we're running the energy out of this tree. Now, running the energy out of this tree, how do we help the tree reaccumulate some energy? Fertilization, supplementation, right? This is vitamins to a regular diet of photosynthesis, okay? So if we want to continue to help this tree produce good buds after this operation, generate new foliage sites for next year, or even potentially transition from that strong to medium to weak down to those smallest, tiniest pieces of growth that have been insignificant to this point, and we want those to be an active, functioning part of this tree, this is the time, right now, okay? So when we talk about growth perpetuation has got to be discussed hand in hand with fertilization. Okay? Now, when we're talking about fertilization at this point in time, what is the fundamental question we have to ask ourselves? What are we trying to accomplish? What are we trying to achieve? Very good, Doug. Thank you for that. What are we trying to accomplish? If you guys are asking how much, if you're asking how often, all of those questions are answered by understanding what are we trying to accomplish, okay? For this tree, I'm trying to produce one more push of growth. I'm trying to produce one more transition of energy. I'm trying to get this tree to push those smallest, most insignificant buds forward one more time, okay? Now what's interesting, and I'll come back to fertilization after we do this operation, what's interesting now is this as an elongating species, and this is true for most of your hemlocks, most of your firs, most of your larches, they're now reaching a point where coming in here and trying to pinch this tip, not going to be effective. And if we come in and we insist, no, I'm going to pinch, we pull off the entire tip. Well, guess what? This tip that this came off of is now dead, right? It will not produce another bud. It will not grow again. That is a sacrificial tip. Now, the advantage of that is there are a few places where there were 3 buds, and so I could show you guys that without any real debilitating impact, okay? But that just goes to show you, once you start to see these needles expanding, once you see these needles expanding from that central core, and you see that central core start to take on a little bit of a color shift from that really bright green to starting to solidify, those needles expanding off of that, that says, hey, listen, if I'm going to increase the surface area that water's being transpired from this needle mass, I've got to have a vascular core that's established enough to deliver the water that's going to hydrate this and keep it photosynthesizing. At that point in time, pinching is no longer possible. Now I'm going to pass this bud around, and what I want you guys to look at is I want you to look down along the stem and see if you can find any adventitious budding on that. Okay, I'm just going to toss that to you. Pass that around, because what I'm going to come back here and do, even though we call this pinching, because the growth is no longer in a pinchable state, I'm going to actually be pruning to transition that energy, removing that apical dominance and transitioning into the interior pieces of growth. So this is going to be happening based on the shape and size of the silhouette that I'm looking for. So that means literally coming in here to any of these, finding dormant buds that exist in here, And if you guys are watching online, I'll get a bud here and I'll prune it for you guys in front of the camera for Ricardo to be able to film. But I'm going to be pruning to the length of this silhouette, okay? And that's really what I want to be doing. Now, when you guys are paying attention and watching this, notice how we have some of these interior branches and we've got longer branches that form our silhouette here. You guys see that? Okay? So what this looks like when we start talking about the structure of a branch, if we're looking at this from the top, we may have all of these pieces of ramification that contribute to this, okay? But when we start looking at this from the side, and we've got these branches that are contributing to our length here, we also have these guys in the middle that contribute to this shape, okay? To that height and that thickness of the pad. Now, if these branches become as long as these pieces that are contributing to the exterior, we lose this shape and we start to get this shape. Have you guys ever had that happen in your trees? Yeah? So there's a hierarchy. This hierarchy is what we were pinching to, right? This exterior silhouette, we pinched to maintain that silhouette. Anything that grew outside of that, we pinched and transitioned energy to interior pieces that were weaker, okay? But also at the same time, we should have been pinching these interior guys that are starting to grow to the same length. So I'm going to rotate this for you. Ricardo, can you see that? See how these pieces are as long as the tip there? Okay? I'm going to rotate this for you guys. Now this is an interior branch that gives me density. Notice how it's the same length as this exterior piece that gives me the silhouette of the branch. Do you guys see that? So when I'm coming back to prune this tree, I've got to be looking at areas like this and I'm saying, okay, I got to prune this back to some interior piece of growth, some bud that's established on the interior here. Obviously, it's going to be quite small when we're pruning spruce of this size, particularly with Engelmann being a very, very small, fine foliar spruce, okay? But I'm going to be pruning that back so that now, when you guys look at this, always leaving some portion of that new growth, always pruning back to a bud at this point in time, notice how I've pulled that length back. And what that's given me is that's given me this shape again. Does that make sense? You've always got to be preserving interior as well as exterior. If everything is growing to the exterior, you're not going to have any more interior, and that creates a branch that is no longer bonsaiable, okay? So the scope of this work, I'm just going to go through a branch here real quick, let you guys ask some questions of me while I'm doing this work. We'll come back and look at this and just see how ironed out and dialed in we can get this thing to be. Does that sound good? Silence. Is that branch still going around? Okay, cool.
Are you finding buds?
I am finding buds.
Are you finding buds on each of those?
I am finding buds. On each of these pieces, I'm finding buds. So I'm cutting back to a place where I have growth set up to take over that transition of energy. Now, there's another thing that I'm also looking for when I'm doing this, and that is a lot of these areas are in pairs of trios of 3, right? So if I have a trio of 3, I've got to take that down to 2 for that ramification to continue to build, okay? So if I'm dealing with 3, that junction where those 3 branches intersect has too much energy moving through it, and that's where we get that inverse swelling or inverse taper, because 3 pieces of ramification functioning through one junction is too much energy for that junction to handle without thickening to accommodate that resource load. And so we get inverse swelling. We see this very dramatically with pines, right? But this is a significant, consistent piece across the board for conifers.
Ryan Bishop's wondering if you can prune a healthy spruce for branch selection now as well.
So that is an interesting question. Can we prune a healthy spruce for branch selection right now?
Oh, he said, never mind, you're just a Jedi. You just answered it.
Yeah.
But maybe answer it again.
I do my best with the Force, Bishop. I do. I aspire to as much. My son Taft asked me if I was a samurai the other day, and I said yes. He's very, very interested in samurais right now. Just having come back from Japan and having translated on stage. So when I went to Japan, the gig was I was supposed to be translating for Mr. Kimura and all of my senpai, or older apprentices. And I got there, and it was a little bit different than what I had expected, because apparently I was the English MC for the entire opening event, and I did not realize that the entire event was such a massive affair. And if you guys, again, haven't seen coverage, I really do encourage you to check out and enjoy the filming that Arthur did while we were there, because it's beautiful. But beyond that, it was probably an event that we'll never see anything like it in the world of bonsai again, including from Japan. I don't know that you're going to see the same thing ever happen again. It was considerably bigger than a small demonstration, right? 40,000 people in 3 days walked through that show, and there were 3,000 people at the opening ceremony, and it was broadcast on NHK, which is the BBC equivalent in Japan, live on their Friday 7 p.m. news slot, which is the single most viewed news slot in Japan. And there I was. And like, I even had this moment where I'm in the dressing room of the TV personality who's the actual MC, and I'm translating him. And they gave me a script. It was like a 36-page script, and they gave it to me like 5 hours before, and they're like, here you go, memorize that. We did a 10-minute walkthrough of over 2 hours of choreography that I was cueing, right? And he was cueing, and in the end, I went into his dressing room about 30 minutes before we went live, and I said, hey, like, I don't think anybody's told you this, but I don't speak Japanese that well. So can we stick to the script? And he said, I don't really like this script, so do your best. Anyways, lo and behold, my Japanese came back to me probably out of sheer panic and fright other than anything else. Went super well. They asked me to do the closing ceremony. Who knows, maybe NHK and Bonsai Mirai work together in the future. I don't know. I'm not hanging my hat on it. But anyways, it was a super interesting experience. I got in a little over my head, but was able to tread water. Yeah.
So is this the last time you're going to pinch this?
So this is it. This is the last time. Yep. And interestingly enough, I'm doing this now. Now there's been a lot of discussion in terms of spruce about when is the last time you can do this piece of work, and then how do you handle the growth after it's done growing. If I do this third working, and I'm just going to show you guys this branch right here, and you compare it to all of the other branches, this piece right here, just how kind of clean and sort of reconciled. Actually, let me get this piece dialed in. I'll show you guys how I do this. Okay, just how clean and reconciled the order of the branches, their length, their size, everything here feels good. Now, if you compare that to these guys that have not been touched yet, you can see there's one more level of refinement, one more level of detail, one more level of kind of finish to this year's piece of growth. Now, the shocking thing would be if I showed you guys what this tree looked like 2 years ago, if I showed you what it looked like last year, and then you saw it this year. That's really going to drive home the point of how this operation continues to allow you to evolve and grow that design, okay? But this is what I'm looking for, and for spruce and elongating species in general, right now or over the course of the next month, which is why you guys are here, preparing for what's coming, right now or over the course of the next month, you should be finalizing your pruning, your shape, and your design for your elongating species that you've been pinching in the refinement model to transition from strong to medium to weak, okay? This is a scope of work just prior to multi-flush pine work, where our garden should be done with the handling of our elongating species, okay? And this helps you guys kind of stay on schedule and stay on task for all of the things that you're going to have to do. Do you guys see that cleanliness and see that order and kind of understanding in this region? Does that make sense? Nuanced for sure. Nuanced for sure. Stack a nuance on top of a nuance on top of a nuance, and all of a sudden you have a new way of doing something, right? Okay? Any questions about this work, that transition, the mode and sort of manner of operation for how we set and define that final third pinching/pruning, transition of energy, and set that branch structure for future development? Do we feel good about that? Yeah? Okay. Scott, what do you got?
In a developing mode, so this tree is in refinement. In a developing mode, are we going to do any kind of pruning now to force the energy back? Or
Good
is that
question.
Come after multi-flush?
Good question. Good question. Okay, so we recognize that pinching is in the refinement mode. Are we all clear about that? Okay. So let's talk about that development mode a little bit. All right, cool. In development, we're saying, listen, we're going to allow it to elongate. We're going to allow this to harden. And we need to see the tree back bud first, okay? So we've been pinching, we've been constantly transitioning energy from strong to medium to weak in the refinement process, okay? That's because we have strong, medium, and weak. Say, for example, you just have strong and you just have weak. The weak are going to die. The strong are rocking and rolling. What do we do then? This is the development phase, okay? The more foliage we generate, the more water and resources move. The more foliage we generate, the more sun is captured and sugars and carbohydrates are moved. And that traffic is what gives us that back bud, okay? That back bud may show up right now. Chances are, on an elongating species, we'll see that back bud in the fall, okay? If we see that back bud in the fall, in order to stimulate and activate that back bud, we can prune that tip back to an established bud and transition that energy from the tip to the interior. You could do that then, or you could do that the following year. Both are capable opportunities for the developmental process. Does that help? Yep, okay. But the more foliage, and this is where black and white and bonsai don't mix. More foliage we have on this tree, the more budding you're gonna get, right? Did anybody see Mike Hagedorn's post on Crataegus, on spring rainfall, longer needles, right? He made a very interesting point in there that I thought was super spot on. He said, the longer the needles get, although it's unfortunate for aesthetics, it's very beneficial for back budding on the tree, right? And all we're saying is the longer the needle, the more surface area. The more surface area, the more water lost. The more water lost, the more photosynthetic resources gained. And the more photosynthetic resources gained, the better the back budding. This is the traffic, as we speak bonsai at Mirai, that we're trying to generate to get denser and denser trees and activate the refinement process of transitioning from strong to medium to weak. We feel good about that? Yeah? Any questions about that? Any questions online about that?
We have a question about fertilization, but not specifically.
Okay.
That.
Let's dive back into fertilization and talk about how we make sure that doing this right now drives this forward, but we don't overdo it. Does that sound good? Okay, I'm gonna just slide this out of the way here for a minute. Okay, so fertilization, what are we trying to accomplish? Now, first fertilization of the year, what were we trying to accomplish? Growth, energy, strength, push it out there, right? We're not abiding by the model that says, the more it grows, the more you got to prune, so let's not fertilize, right? No, we're saying let's fertilize. Let's fertilize and fertilize and fertilize, depending on what we're trying to accomplish, okay? Depending on what we're trying to accomplish. For the most part, in elongating species, if we want to get a denser, more ramified, more highly refined tree, we've got to fertilize, fertilize, fertilize until we get there, okay? We're still not here. We're getting very close. In the next 2 years, my fertilization will have to change for this tree once I get to that really highly refined product, okay? But right now, heavy fertilizer on a 4-week basis, heavy timing, heavy application in terms of quantity to get this growth to push. First application, second application. Now we're at the third application. How warm was it yesterday? 91. So if we just take a quick little zoom in, Ricardo, can you grab that shot right there? Okay, what's happening on this spruce, and you guys can watch this, this is an archive video that you can watch whether you're a Mirai Live member or not. You'll see that there's burn on this from yesterday, right? Now, anytime that we start to get new growth and warm temperatures happening too rapidly, right, we will get burning of that tissue, okay? What that's telling us, and if you guys have looked at the forecast for the next 10 days, we have more temperatures of that same nature coming. Okay? So we're entering that phase. We jump from literally winter to summer, right? We kind of bypass spring. The leaves came out somewhere in there, and then like all of a sudden it's summer, okay? We're starting to enter a phase in time where we're going to be experiencing intense heat, okay? You should have been fertilizing already to be driving this growth forward, and I feel like we established that. Now this last application to make sure that we provide the kind of supplemental nutrition. Being we've run out all of the stored energy that's in this tree, we need to fertilize one more time, okay? But this fertilization towards the end of this growth cycle has a very different function. We're preparing this tree to produce those buds after that summer off session, right? Where the trees kind of take a little bit of a, it's hot, I'm not really feeling like doing much. We get into that fall growth. The nutrition we give right now is what perpetuates and continues to drive forward bud production in that fall growth, okay? So we're saying, listen, third application, we're looking all the way towards initiation of fall vascular tissue development. Basically what we're doing is we're increasing stored resources inside the tissue of this tree with this next application, okay? Now, here's why this matters. We know the tree is going to photosynthesize on its own already, correct? So do we need to go as heavy? Do we need to be doing as much with fertilizer? And if not, why would we not want to anyways? What is fertilizer to a tree outside of supplemental nutrition? Fertilizer in a tree, salt, right? Salt. So in the old school books about bonsai, if you read about how you cultivate bonsai, they say don't fertilize in the summertime. And you say, well, why the heck wouldn't you do that? Well, technically, if a tree is using the water to cool down this system, and you've got a high salt concentration inside of this container, that's going to be competing with that water uptake that needs to move through this tree to air condition all of that growth, okay? So when we start to get into warmer temperatures in the latter portion of spring, entering that earlier midsummer sort of section of temperatures, we got to pull back on quantity. We don't want that same amount of competition for water movement in the tree now that the tree is at the end of its growth cycle and we're entering the hot portion of summer. So we're going to pull back and we're going to say this third application, let's go with a moderate or a light quantity, and I believe light quantity of application. Okay, and so we start to talk about fertilization in bonsai as in the spring, ramping up, right? It's middle of the spring, when we apply that second dosage, we're just hammering that thing. As long as what we want to accomplish is growth, we're fertilizing, okay? And then that tree's going and we're transitioning energy, or we're growing because we're developing, or we're building strength, and then all of a sudden, it runs that out. We get to this point, temperatures are going up, vascular system is hardening off, needles are starting to take on their cuticle, and we decelerate fertilization moving into the summer. Yeah? Okay, so what you guys need to be looking to do at the beginning of June, or in terms of when you've been applying fertilizer, if you've been going on a 4-week schedule because you're heavily applying, if you've been going with high quantities, I just need you to ramp that back, dial down that dosage so that you let that tree naturally prepare and gear up for the heat that's probably going to come our way this summer. Solid? Elongating species, awesome. Fertilization, awesome. What do we got?
Question. Alex says, I just repotted a spruce this spring. Is all pinching and pruning off this year in order to let it grow stronger?
Alex, good question. Okay, repotting is a big question for everybody. I repotted, do I now pull back? How do we start to decide on those big decisions, whether we work or don't work? What is the thing that tells us what to do? Response of the tree, absolutely. Alex, is your tree vigorously growing, or is your tree showing signs that it's stressed from that repotting process? If there's any concern, hold back. If the tree is rocking out, go forward, okay?
Moderate.
Sure, moderate, all good, right? If in doubt, we can always come back and regain, right? We can go past and pull back. If you guys are members of Mirai Live, there's a stream, an archive video on a Colorado spruce that became this big, and we said, listen, we had to get it to this point to prune off the amount of branches that we pruned off and pull it back to where it's at, right? We had to go past to pull back. If in doubt, go past, because we can always pull back. But if we're trying to manage, when it's not even ready to go forward, that's when we set ourselves back not just a year, but 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, or worst case scenario, fatality, right? Okay, if in doubt, hold back. All right. I'm gonna sign off the spruce. Are we good with this? Yeah. Okay. Okay, Coast Live Oak, Broadleaf Evergreen. Now this is interesting to be approaching a Broadleaf Evergreen with you guys, because I want to be attacking this Broadleaf Evergreen in a very similar fashion to the way I would be attacking a deciduous piece of material. At this point in time in cultivation, this time of year, the right signs, the right indicators, the right action that we can take on this, okay? So what we're seeing here, and let's just talk and make sure that we understand. What we're seeing here is untouched growth in some portions, and we're also seeing some growth that's been pinched and is producing a second flush in others. So if you guys notice here on the stream and you guys out there in the audience, you'll see some small, very fine flushes of growth, okay? This is because this branch was pinched when the first few leaves emerged. This is the second flush, okay? You'll also see these big long pieces that have a lot different color. For example, here, a lot different color green on it. This was not pinched. This was not touched. And this is to show you guys, this piece of material has been prepped for this stream to show you guys the difference of how the tree responds. Now I want to show you guys how to handle a tree that you've allowed to grow if you're trying to rein it back, start the ramification process, or start the refinement process, okay? So whenever we're looking at a piece of growth like this, and this goes for most of our deciduous species, not all, okay? Most of our deciduous species, we're going to take this back to 2 new pieces, new leaves, 2 new pieces of growth. Now there is potential, because we've let this grow, that this internode could be extremely long. We could, if we decided, take that back to 1, okay? Depends on how long we want it to be. Depends on the size of the silhouette, the shape of the branch, etc., whether we keep 2 or 1. But let's all just understand that we do have to maintain at least 1 or some portion of that new growth, okay? That is the most photosynthetically efficient piece on this tree, okay? So when I'm looking at this, I'm just going to come in here, and I'm going to be taking these back to 2 pieces so that I can shorten a lot of the internodes that have occurred over the course of this spring, maybe leaving 1 in some areas where they've gotten really long. But I'm just going to be taking this back. Now some of these, like this one for example, I left this one on a little bit too long last year. I didn't prune it. It grew again. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take this all the way back to there. As long as I don't do that across the entire tree, I'm going to be A-okay. Okay? So those areas where you get those pieces of growth growing out of the shape that you want, you're just taking these guys back. Okay? Now, that's very easy to understand, yeah? We're good there. If it elongates and we want to cut it back, we want interior branching, we want transition of strength, we want to shorten that, we prune back to 2 or maybe 1 set of growth. Good? Okay, here's the next thing. On a species like a coast live oak, on a species like an Elaeagnus or a silverberry, on a species like a beech, or on a species like potentially a maple or a hornbeam, that first flush of growth is going to have so much energy because all that stored energy from the fall is being pushed into that first flush of growth, and the tree is saying, the bigger the solar panel I can make with this thing, the more resources I can accumulate, the bigger the tree I can be, and I'm going to be this big tree, okay? But we're saying, but I want you to be small. I know you want to be a big tree, but I want you to be small, okay? Now, one way to stop that is the pinching process, right? So when those first few leaves come out, for example, this is the second flush of growth right here. I'm just going to pinch this back to that first leaf. That stops that elongation of that internode. That stops that expansion of growth. That's one way to handle it, okay? Now we recognize that all of us have jobs, all of us have lives outside of bonsai. We may not be there to pinch every piece of growth. I went on vacation, I came home, my tree looks like this now. Got it, me too, right? I was in Japan, and then I drove a truck across the country, and I came home, and I was like, holy crap. Okay? There is a way to transition back, and I'm going to show you that. Okay? So we prune back to those 2. Now watch closely. I'm going to take this big initial leaf, and I'm going to cut it in half or even down by potentially 30%. Okay? I'm going to cut that down by 30%. And I'm going to come in here where I've got all of these older leaves, and I'm just going to randomly, and preferably off of the bottom so that we clean up the bottom of the branch. But I'm going to more or less randomly remove roughly 30% of those leaves. Any of these big pieces, I can take the ones off the bottom. I can go ahead and cut the bigger ones in half. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to remove 30, 40, potentially even 50%, depending on how strong the tree is and also how aggressively we've been fertilizing to accomplish whatever we are striving to accomplish, okay?
Ryan,
yeah.
Grant's wondering if the new growth, is the new growth more efficiently photosynthetic because of its position or because of its structure?
It's more photosynthetically efficient because it hasn't been scarred by the constant wind, sand, UV desiccation, etc. And it also doesn't have as thick of a cuticle. So when we start to think, you put a tree in a greenhouse, right? That tree will never produce the same growth inside that greenhouse as it will outside of that greenhouse. And do you know why? Because now you have filtered sun. It doesn't have to for sure, right? But even the best greenhouse plastic is maybe giving you 85, 88% ultraviolet transparency. That means that you're losing 10, 12, 15, 20% inside of a greenhouse in the best, newest plastic that you could put in best coating, right? So if that's the case, and you have filtration on that, what does that mean the tree has to do? Produce longer internodes, larger leaves, accumulate more ultraviolet rays to reaccumulate the energy of generating that foliage mass, okay? So when we start to look at new growth is a lot like a greenhouse without the plastic coating, right? We're getting more resources into that leaf with a small amount of cuticle that's just forming, and it's less scarred, less damaged. We're getting more light, more photosynthetic efficiency. Grant, I hope that answers your question, okay? So coming back to the task at hand. Now this is an interesting technique in terms of the fact that there are still a lot of people that practice total defoliation. Anybody in the room totally defoliate any of your deciduous trees? Don't be bashful. Yeah, raise your hand. Everybody put them up. Let's all sympathize with each other. Yes, we do it, we do it. Okay, so there's a real dangerous little thing as a game here that you're playing when you totally defoliate a tree. You have a tree that had an amount of energy accumulated to allow that tree to not just survive, but hopefully potentially generate new growth that allows it to continue to expand and move forward. And you've taken all that growth off, right? So this is to say that you might get away with that once, you might get away with that twice, you might get away with that for 2 years, you might get away with that for 5 years, you might get away with that for 7 years, you might get away with that for 10 years. There will come a point, if you fully defoliate your trees, that tree will not produce leaves like it has every other year. And you can't explain why, and you don't know what reason. And this year, I'm telling you guys, if you're in the Pacific Northwest with the abundance of rain that we've had and your trees were outside, this is not the year to defoliate. Not the year, okay? Because we've had so much rain that whether you guys see it or not, the root systems of our trees are heavily impaired this year, which is exactly why at 89 degrees that spruce burned. Not because it can't handle that, but because its root system, and I've seen this across the board with my junipers, I've seen this across the board with my pines, we probably suffered some root loss due to anaerobic conditions over the winter season based on the immense load. This would be a year where you go in and you defoliate your Japanese maple that you've defoliated for the past 20 years, and for whatever reason it doesn't push out the same amount of growth this year. So I'm going to caution you guys about that total defoliation. Now what I'm showing you here is partial defoliation. This is a very beautiful technique, partial defoliation is, and here's why. You're never fully denuding the tree of all of its ability to reaccumulate resources, okay? So you're gonna come in and you're gonna remove 30 or 40% and cut these big leaves in half. Now, why am I cutting the big leaves in half? Aesthetic for sure, right? Aesthetic for sure. Looks better, doesn't it? I mean, this looks better already, okay? Yeah. But go beyond that. Why else would we be cutting these bigger leaves in half? Okay, let sunlight into the interior. All the big leaves are going to be on the exterior. Very good, very nice. I love that logic. Why else? Okay, less photosynthesis. Now, Roger, why would I want less photosynthesis? Same reason you want less fertilizer. Same reason I want less fertilizer. Okay, so you're saying because we're entering the heat of the summer? Okay, potentially. Now, what did we say was the problem with this first flush of growth? Too big, too vigorous, too coarse, right? I've got all this stored energy over the course of the fall through the winter. It erupts in the spring and gives me new growth. And that new growth, it's gigantic, right? And we're saying, whoa, trying to make a bonsai here, okay? We can prune it back. We can't fully remove it, right? But that second flush of growth, remember, come back to what we're talking about with the spruce here. We're saying with the spruce, we're entering a phase of growth where it's at the tail end of its energy allocation, and we're trying to perpetuate growth through the remainder of this latter portion of spring. The second flush on this tree, I want it to be as fine, small, tight, short as it possibly can. This is how you get it done. You get light to the interior branches, and to some degree, we're removing some of that strength from the tree so that the next flush is far more fine and bonsaiable, okay? Now this is a balance, because if I hadn't been fertilizing aggressively, I couldn't do this. You have to build up that energy. Knowing the tree's tapping out its natural resources, you gotta be building up the energy to supplement this operation with the fertilization process, okay? But this partial defoliation, we will do this on any oak that we've been cultivating that came out too big, that's elongated too much, which I'm gonna say is probably every oak we own because they're extremely aggressive. Okay, I'm gonna come in here and I'm gonna do this to all of them. 30%, 40% of the leaves, big leaves get cut in half to allow light. I wanna decrease the tree's energy just slightly, right? And what I get in return is I get a much finer second flush. That's the flush that I actually create my ramification from. So what you guys will see come the fall season or come spring of next year, this tree's already dropped all of it. Ah, here we go. There's an older leaf that was cut in half last spring. And these broadleaf evergreens are shedding all of that growth right now as that new growth is emerging. Because they're transitioning. They're saying, okay, I no longer need you. Look at what I generated in return, and we're going to say, good job, we fed you to drive that growth forward. Now I'm sorry, but I did it, okay? And look at what kind of growth in terms of leaf comparison that you get in return. Can you guys all see that? Can you guys see that? That's a difference from the first flush to the second flush of last year. After having all those leaves and doing a partial defoliation, you get that kind of reduction in leaf size, right? It's crazy. It's crazy. And all this is just understanding how the tree is functioning, when it's doing what it's doing, and why you're doing what you're doing to get it to do something better than it naturally wants to do. It naturally wants to be a big tree. We want to make it a small tree. How do you make a big tree become a small tree? You use a confined environment, appropriate fertilization, and the appropriate pruning techniques to hold that growth back, okay?
Ryan, could this partial defoliation technique be used on other deciduous trees?
Yeah, so again, this is a technique that has a lot of strength and applicability across the board for our deciduous. So this is a broadleaf evergreen, an oak, right? We can do this with beech, we can do this with maples, we can do this with hornbeams, we can do this with any tree that has a very big, thick, coarse flush of initial growth. For example, the way that I will handle all of my beech that have a very, very big leaf on that first flush. I don't panic, I don't freak out, I'm not worried about it ruining my tree. What I'll do on a refined tree, I may pinch that tip so that I stop that growth. You guys have seen the product of that pinching. We get these much finer flushes coming out the second time around, okay? That makes sense because all the energy that was pushed in there before it reaccumulated, I pinched it off. It would make sense that the second flush would be much shorter, okay? Or if that tree is allowed to elongate time, we wanted to reaccumulate energy. We needed length, we needed thickening, we needed healing, okay? Or we just simply missed the operation, we can come back and do this exact thing. We can do this same operation on, say, for example, a really robust trident maple 3-4 times a year. We can do this same operation on a zelkova or an elm 3-4 times a year. And what it does is it allows us to build up this immense amount of ramification while preserving the strength of the tree. This is a this singular technique, very major technique for the development of deciduous and broadleaf evergreen trees.
What about a Satsuki?
Satsuki azalea is totally different, has no application whatsoever to what I'm doing here. Let's just draw that line in the sand. Satsuki is over there. We're right in this realm right here.
I have a question about, or Rennie has a question about fertilizing. Why not start just prior to new growth since it takes time for organics to work rather than waiting for new growth to start?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when we start to talk about fertilization, right, we're not saying that fertilization is what's driving that growth. We're saying that the stored energy is what's driving the initial growth. So if we're fertilizing, thinking that the fertilizing is stimulating that growth, we have the wrong conception about how that's happening, right? What we're trying to do is we're trying to supplement future operations with that initial application of fertilizer and continue to, again, perpetuate growth, continue to drive growth forward once that tree taps out all of its stored energy, okay? This is a major concept for you guys to grab, put in your pocket, and take home. I'm going to be asking you all what you learned tonight before we leave. Everybody better be grabbing onto something, okay? I'm warning you now. Put it in your pocket and have it there. Yes, sir. Can we get a microphone over here, please?
I think I have to be heard.
No, it's for the stream.
You need it for the stream.
Unfortunately, you do have to hold the mic tonight.
I've been watching you trying to figure out your system. I think I figured it out. You're going from the bottom to the top, and then you jump to another area. And is it just random, or do you have a mental process you're going through?
Well, so if this tree was wired, I would definitely be going through a very systematic process from the bottom to the top. Okay. Now, what's happening tonight is I'm looking for areas that I can easily illustrate on camera. I'm also looking for areas that I can give you guys kind of a big chunk where I can separate what has been done from what hasn't been done so that you have the visual cues to be able to understand the difference. So as I'm working along the bottom here and not touching the top or touching small remnants of the top, it's just to give you a clear band of where this technique has been executed. Definitely not the way that I would say, hey, this is how you should work on your trees, right? Because the more systematic, and this is the thing about bonsai work that when you talk about people trained in the United States versus people trained in Japan, the one thing that you get in Japan that you just simply cannot substitute for is the regimented discipline of daily practice, right? And you'll notice that every single person trained in Japan has a very specific order of operations. It's how you have that foundation to be able to go out and explore with and know you can come back to that system of operations and have effect. Yeah. So for Mr. Kimura, that was always, you start at the bottom, you set major structural components first, and then you come back at the bottom and you start working the finer branches all the way up to the apex. And that would be the same way that we would prune, that would be the same way that we needle pluck, that would be the same way that everything that we do, okay?
Kathy's wondering if you would cut the leaves on a beach.
Absolutely.
You would?
Absolutely. Now, there's another thing that I should bring up to you guys, and that is there is another level of craftsmanship that we can apply to this operation. So I'm flat cutting. Here's an old piece that I've flat cut, right? That looks not all that great, okay? This is for efficiency of operation. Say, for example, this tree needs to be shown, okay? There's multiple ways that we can do this, but if we just barely fold that leaf up, we cut that at an angle, that's the shape that we get on the leaf. Okay, which looks a lot more natural. And when you're looking at a tree that's only had a portion of the leaves pruned, this is a great way to allow those to blend in so that you can't see the leaves that are cut versus the leaves that are not cut. Okay, so there is another level of detail. There is another level of detail that we can take into account when we're doing this operation that starts to disguise some of the technique that we're applying. Does that make sense? Yeah? There's always another level of depth in the rabbit hole with bonsai, always.
Caesar's wondering if you could apply this technique to tropicals.
I'm sure you could apply this technique to tropicals because tropicals are growing so vigorously, right? Bougainvillea would be a classic tropical that you could apply this to. I know that there is a lot of defoliation that's applied to buttonwoods. I know that Pemphis also has the significant ability to have leaf reduction take place. Now, timing and quantity and your fertilization approach to tropicals is probably going to need to shift and adapt a little bit depending on where you're at and what you're trying to accomplish. But I think the same questions could be asked. I think the same approach can be taken to reduction of growth. And I think the same partial defoliation with that broad-leafed nature of tropicals is very, very realistic.
Tom noticed that you're not removing any branching, even straight up or straight down branching at this time. Is there a reason for that?
So this tree needs to be completely rewired. It's been wired once in its lifetime. It's taken on a really, really natural, this branch right here in particular, in my mind, makes this an oak, And this just goes to stylistic discussion of that natural character and nature of design. But this whole thing needs kind of another round of wire on it. And I've been aspiring to get to this since like last summer. And it just isn't a tree that's been in the queue compared to other stuff that we've been doing, okay?
So that's why you're not.
So that's why I'm not. But there will be a lot of branch reduction, and I'll probably do the work on this tree and then post it so that you guys can see the finished product of it. I feel like that's been an effective way to carry this through the entire process. Maybe that'll be a tertiary clip to this stream right here that you guys, if you're subscribers, can get in on. Any questions about broadleaf evergreens or deciduous handling with that massive push? Can we get a microphone up to Roger here?
Relative to what you said about the extremely wet spring, would you modify what you're doing, the partial defoliation this year because of that?
Yeah, good question. So relative to the wet spring and potential impediment that we've had on the root system. Now this is very interesting. This is a coast live oak. Coast live oak cannot tolerate our winters in the Pacific Northwest. This tree was greenhoused. Water was entirely controlled. Therefore, the vigor of this tree is every bit as strong as it's ever been in any other year, right? And that's why I'm able to get away with this. Now, if this were a tree that were left outside and had suffered to some degree, for example, our junipers are dropping needles prematurely, older growth, they're shedding them, right? Douglas firs as well, shedding older needles. This is not the time for that to happen. Not until the new growth hardens do they typically drop their older growth. But we're seeing it early because we don't have the root system to support all of that growth. So we're seeing them do a little bit of an unnatural thing at this point in time. Pines have a little bit of a casting on the tip. They've got some funky color, a little bit of yellowing. Maybe you guys have seen all of this and you're saying, what the heck is going on? This is largely due to the environmental impact of such a wet, long, prolonged winter, okay? But this was in the greenhouse. It's what allows me to do this. Okay. So we want the same amount of foliage mass across the entire tree. If I have areas that are thicker and more dense, areas that are thinner, naturally the areas that have more foliage mass are transpiring more. Transpiring means more water is being moved there. More water is being moved there, more nutrition is being moved there. More nutrition is being moved there, the chance of growth happening there is far greater. That area is going to continue to get stronger. Now you could use that to your advantage if you have an extremely weak area, right? But this is just fundamental knowledge of how water is moved, how nutrition is moved, how photosynthetic resources are generated. Use that to the best of your ability to capture what the tree is fully potential and capable of, okay? All right, broadleaf evergreens, a lot of forms of deciduous trees, really excellent little lesson over the next month that you guys can apply to your trees back home, okay? So we know in the world of bonsai, right? Multi-flush pines, Japanese black pine, Japanese red pine. We also have some native North American pines, Virginia pine, pitch pine, and several of the southeastern native pines capable of having their first flush of growth fully removed, okay, and producing from that cut site a second flush of growth that fully matures in the same season, okay? So we call these multi-flush pine because we're going to come in here and we're going to take off that entire piece of growth. And as a result of taking that off, where you had one piece of growth, you're going to get the emergence of several new buds that will fully mature into a formed candle with needles and a terminal bud this same year. Multi-flush, okay? So if we contrast that with a single flush pine, for example, a ponderosa pine, Japanese white pine. Japanese white pine produces that growth. You cut that off, that's a dead tip. End of story, end of your day, okay? But with the Japanese black pine or our other multi-flush pine species, we can come in and we can remove that growth and they will produce a second flush that fully matures. Do we understand that? Okay, understanding that is one thing. We know now we're capable of that. The reason for doing that is far more significant than knowing that you can. Why? Why cut that piece of growth off? Why come in and remove that first flush? What are we trying to accomplish? Okay, shorter needles. Very good. Ramification. Excellent. One more.
Back bud.
Okay, that would be we're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to back bud. So let me just show you this guy here because I'm going to have to prune it anyways. How long is that internode before those needles start? You see the needles start all the way up here. An inch, at least an inch, right? Now we're saying we want this tree to be a nice, compact, tight, beautiful bonsai. You have an inch of growth here without any needles on it whatsoever. Is that usable bonsai growth? Okay, this is the exact same situation that we had with the coast live oak over here, where we prune that back, cut that in half, and we're going to get a finer flush of growth on interior buds behind that. This is the exact same theory and concept of why. Shorter needles, shorter internodes, and bifurcation, an area where we had one shoot, we will get several, and in the fall, we'll take it down to 2, okay? So you're seeing so many pieces of this knowledge just being repeated, right? Just being repeated. With the spruce, I'm taking it down to 2, right? With the coast live oak, I'm taking away that long internode and I'm taking away that coarse first flush. Bonsai, there was a time where I skipped out on staying at Mr. Kimura's garden because it was snowing and I probably should have been there to dust the snow off the tree. And I went to a party of other bonsai apprentices, and it wasn't like a raging drinking party like you think of in the United States. It was more like we all kind of sat around and like, you know, just pleasantly sipped, but it was cool. And one of the apprentices that had been an apprentice for Bonsai, which is where the Kato family, all right, Saburo Kato, Bonsai, the pillar of the Omiya Bonsai Village, one of the apprentices that had been a long-time apprentice there, he said, so you're at Mr. Kimura's? I said, yes. He said, wow, that's amazing. You're going to learn so much about bonsai. And I said, yes, he's very conifer heavy, and so I'm going to know a lot about conifers. And he said, bonsai is bonsai is bonsai, right? All of the techniques that you learn there are applicable to every other tree if you learn how to think about bonsai. That never left me. That singular conversation never left me because it has become so incredibly inclusive of everything that we do, right? And it's knowing why we do what we do that guides when we do it, how we do it, etc. Does that make sense? Okay, perfect. Shorter needles, shorter internodes, and bifurcation, where 1, there is now 2, okay? So I'm going to come in here. Now I've got these branchlets here, and I'm going to rotate this for you guys. You can see I cut off that major central one. In order for this to work, I've got to cut off all of those, okay? Because all of those had longer internodes. Even though the interior ones were very, very short, once I remove that central bud, once I remove this guy, right? Once that guy's gone, pine's strength comes from the roots. That means that once I take this away, if all my strength is coming from here, those 2 smaller guys are just going to take over where that one was removed, okay? So I've got to remove all of those pieces of growth in that area. Okay? Now at this time of year, and this is where multi-flush pines get so incredibly difficult, right? Do I pinch the candles in half for the really long ones? Do I start by removing the strongest ones first and then I start by removing the weakest ones first and then the medium ones 10 days, or was it 2 weeks later, and I have needles that I have to pluck, and then I was gonna, have you guys all read those articles? You've all done that? You've been there, right? That's good, because we're going to simplify it, right? Mr. Kimura's nursery, we had to do over 400 multi-flush pines in the period of 20 days. We started pruning candles on June 15th. We finished pruning candles on July 5th, okay? That meant that at the end of the day, we had a needle mass and candle mass up to our knees in his tiny little workshop. Now, being the youngest apprentice for the first 3 years of my apprenticeship, candle pruning season was hands down the worst because they're sharp and you have so much to clean up in a very limited amount of time that I had to go to work an hour early during candle pruning season as the youngest apprentice, okay? So what I'm saying to you guys is, as opposed to breaking candles in half and doing this and doing that and cutting this now and then waiting 2 weeks and coming back and being like, oh, is this a medium or is this a weak? Because now it's longer than it was, and it was medium, but now is it strong, and so do I wait on this? And then the little ones are a little bit bigger, and, right? Cut them all. Cut them all. Cut every single one. Not only do you cut every single one, you're going to cut ones that haven't even started growing. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to leave a few millimeters of growth, okay? I want to leave a few millimeters of growth, because that few millimeters of growth is where all of that new budding is going to originate from. But I'm going to come in here and I'm going to cut every single one of these. Okay, and here's why. Theories about black pine and multi-flush pine up to this point have hinged on using the candle as your ability to balance the strength in the tree. I have a strong candle, I should break that in half. That'll weaken that candle. No, wrong. Strength comes from the roots. The way that that responds is the next bud next to it just becomes super strong. That one stays as strong as it is, and now you got 2 pieces that are equally as strong as that one, right? How do we, if the strength is coming from the roots, how do we dictate where that energy is moved in the tree?
Needle plucking.
And why needle plucking? Hang on, microphone. Greg. Just kidding. I didn't mean to be snappy.
By reducing needles in an area, you're reducing the photosynthesis and weakening that area.
Yeah, okay, okay.
Leaving an area with lots of needles.
Nice, nice. So you're saying the way that we allocate energy in a multi-flush pine is via needle plucking. Is that what you're telling me? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
I love the way your mind works. I love it. Beautiful, okay? What we're saying is, in a pine, strength is in the roots. If we look at the root system of a pine, it's very, very coarse, very thick, right? That is a storage organ. Okay, when we look at the root system of a juniper, it's all fine, right? If you went into the Mojave Desert in the fall, when the rains hit those trees, they produce a new patch of root at the surface to take on that moisture. When it dries up in the summer, those roots all dry up, fall away, and it goes to its taproot to survive over the course of the summer. And then in the winter, when it rains again, those fall rains, we get all that fine rootage up near the surface again, okay? When we cultivate junipers in a bonsai pot, we're leaning on very fine root system. That is not a storage organ. Very thick coarse root system, storage organ, right? Consequently, with pines, we need a lot of microbiotic activity in the container. What do we call that? What do we call that microbiotic activity that we see in the container of pines? Mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae, right? Now all of a sudden you start to understand why mycorrhizae is necessary, because you have a very coarse root system. Coarse root system stores a lot of energy. Coarse root system not so good at taking on water and nutrition. Mycorrhizae, the symbiotic relationship of microorganisms and the tree's root, those microorganisms are acting as the fine root system for the roots of a pine. In exchange, they get some of that stored resource to survive on. That is the beautiful symbiosis of mycorrhizae, okay? So that storage organ, sending all those sugars and carbohydrates north, we know that water and nutrition goes to the place where transpiration is taking place, correct? More needles, more water lost. More water lost, more nutrition taken to that area, more photosynthesis that takes place, more resources to the roots. And the roots are saying, thanks for paying up. Let me give you some more water and nutrition. Oh, thank you for the sugars and carbohydrates. Let me give you some more water and nutrition, okay? So if we take that needle count down in those stronger areas, we close that gap of what is weak and strong, right? So we're not using candles to distribute the strength in a pine. We're cutting all of them, strong, medium, weak, unemerged, right now. And what we have to come back and do is close the gap of the needle density between the strong and the weak, okay? So I'm gonna buzz through this really quickly so that you guys can just see the candle pruning process. And then I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna show you how many needles we take off and why, so that you have a much clearer idea of what you guys are doing.
In terms of timing, why is right now the time to do this?
So again, and Ricardo, if you can get in here to this weak guy, that'll just give a really nice illustration of just how weak we're taking that guy off. So if we start to look at timing, this is a little bit early because you guys are going to be doing this entering June through the month of June, okay? Slightly early, bigger tree, early in development. If I cut it now, I'm going to get a little bit of a longer needle and a little bit coarser growth because I've got a longer period of time before this tree shuts down for its summer dormancy, which when we start to look at this, right, yeah, how do we determine that timing? I still have not come up with a good explanation of why June in the Northern Hemisphere is ideal, right? Now, for anybody looking or watching from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, our June is your December, okay? So keep that in mind. You'd be applying the same technique come December. If you want to start to dive into that, it becomes quite confusing to start talking about technique and the transition of technique across hemispheres.
So June just in the Northern Hemisphere, even in, say, the East Coast where it's colder?
So definitely on the East Coast where it's colder, June is okay. But the farther north you go, the earlier you've got to do it. So you guys all know Aaron Packard from the Pacific Bonsai Museum, the curator up there. They have that big, gigantic black pine that they showed at the Artisans Cup back in 2015. Do you guys know the tree from Amy Liang? Massive black pine. He literally can't prune that early enough to get the elongation on the candles to give him the needle length that he needs for that tree. So now he has to stagger it. 1 year he prunes it, 1 year he doesn't. 1 year he prunes it, 1 year he doesn't, right? So when we're looking at this, if we take this tree, this size, and we say, okay, in the northern hemisphere, this far north in the United States, I will prune this on June 1st, and I will get needles that will be this length, that length, or shorter. That feels good, proportional to the size of this tree, right? What if I have a shohin tree? Prune it later. Prune it later. And when we say prune it later, we're giving less time for the second flush to elongate and harden before the tree shuts down. Okay? Shuts down. Why? Summer dormancy, right? Why? What is summer dormancy? I know we have winter dormancy. Summer dormancy? Got to take a break, right? Every single tree in a temperate climate, 2 periods of dormancy, summer and winter. 2 periods of growth, spring and fall.
So what would be some indicators that you've missed the decandling window?
If these new candles fully extend, elongate the needles, darken, sharpen, and become firmly attached, that's saying, ooh, we may have waited too long. That growth is officially hardened, and those adventitious buds at the base of that may not sprout if we cut it, okay? All right, so having pruned, let me just make sure. I wanted this to be pretty quick, yeah. Having pruned every candle that's growing in a place. Now, I do have candles like this. This is a very, very underdeveloped branch right here. If I'm going to use this in the design, I need this to at least be this long. I'm not going to cut that. I'm not going to cut that, right? I want that to elongate, to develop. We got a question back there. Can you take that back there? Okay. So now that I've pruned every candle, I want to come in and I want to take the strong down to the weak in terms of density. Now, I can illustrate that for you guys just in here. Notice how many needles are on this extremely strong shoot. I'm guessing if you counted, there would be close to 50 pairs of needles, okay? If I just move that, notice how many needles are on that weaker shoot right there. I'm guessing if I counted that, it would probably be close to 20, all right? I'm going to take this strong down at least to that threshold in order to close that gap, okay? So naturally, I want to be thinking about function and aesthetics, which means I'm going to be taking off needles growing off the bottom. I'm going to be taking them off equivalently in a radial direction so that I still give this that pine-shaped bud. The worst thing you can do is take a pine bud, pluck off all of one side of the needles, and just have this really bald, weird-looking thing growing there, okay? So I'm doing a radial distribution, and I'm going to take this down to 10 to 12 pairs, okay? I'm going to take this down to 10 to 12 pairs. Do you guys see that? Does that scare you? Should, a little bit. We'll talk about why, though, because you need to know why that should scare you, okay? This is what I'm looking for. So we're saying, listen, I want to close the gap from the strong to the weak. This is why we're removing needles. Let's start with your question. Yes, sir?
So this is a big tree.
Okay.
With a big trunk and a lot of mass.
Sure.
And it doesn't have many needles. Are you hindering its ability to take in the sunlight, et cetera, in the proportion that it needs?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I'm playing on the tree's strength and the nuanced ability for it to regenerate growth. And I've strategically built up its energy via the fertilization process to be able to perform this reduction that is very severe to induce a second flush that has shorter needles, shorter internodes, and gives me better ramification. So I will continue to build this tree up to that density that I want, but if you don't do this, you just get year after year of long internode and long needle without any ramification, because this, as a pine, wants to be a gigantic tree, right? And so this is one of those ways that we work inside of what the species can tolerate and what it will give us if we handle it correctly. Does that make sense? Cool. Yes, sir.
A follow-on question to that. Over time, for this tree, would you try to develop more foliage, given the size of the trunk?
Absolutely.
Root structure?
Absolutely, absolutely. This is just the beginning, and this is an interesting part of multi-flush development, is you would think, okay, well, I gotta let this thing grow more. It doesn't have enough needles, right? But you've got to get the right kind of growth for it to be a bonsai. And the right kind of growth is short internodes and short needles that give you tight ramification, because the proportion that this foliage mass is going to be to this tree is not going to be, in terms of the exterior silhouette, a whole lot bigger than this. We just need a lot more inside of that, right? And this is how we can activate that process. Yes, sir?
If you wanted to encourage back budding in a specific spot on a branch, would you want to leave?
Leave needles in that location. That's naturally going to be a place where you're going to get a lot higher likelihood of back budding to occur. So particularly when you're talking about a tree, now this has been candle pruned once before to get this kind of ramification and transitioning of strength, particularly when you're talking about a nursery tree that just has this big, long growing branch, right? And you want buds back in here, and you're plucking all the needles to balance the energy. You want to leave needles in lateral locations. That will give you a higher likelihood of buds forming there, absolutely, right? Okay, so I'm going to continue to just kind of go through this and reduce this needle mass so that I hopefully have an equivalent needle mass across the entire tree. Now, coming back to your question of, gosh, it seems like you need more needles in order to be able to sustain this tree. Well, we've built the energy up so that this tree has the stored resources to regenerate the growth, right? That's a big part of it. When we talk about, again, growth perpetuation, we've been gearing this tree up for this, okay? So it's not like I just picked a tree up off the street and I was like, I'm just going to cut off all of its new growth and denude it of needles and it's going to work for me. No, I've been preparing it for this, okay? But there's that cutoff. There's that threshold. And we typically say 10 to 12 pairs of needles per shoot when we're initially closing the gap is a really solid threshold that you can leave on the tree and it'll have enough photosynthetic mass to continue driving growth forward, okay? Yes, Al. Can we get a mic to Al?
I repotted a black pine this year, and it's coming back with pretty heavy candle growth. And I'm going to knock down all those candles per your advice. But do I need to take a more measured approach to needle pruning if I just repotted it this year?
So yeah, I would say so, right? If it's giving you the kind of elongation in the candles that said you're going to have too long of an internode and too long of needles, then decandling that tree is perfectly acceptable. If it's got tiny little buds and you're saying, boy, I repotted it, it's not really showing me that it has the strength to endure this operation, I would hold back. But even if it's giving you that kind of candle and you freshly repotted it this year, I would probably err on the side of caution and leave more needles as opposed to take more. Okay, yeah, absolutely. Okay? And I want to come back into here. Now notice this comes back to your question about where you're going to get back budding. Okay? You guys see all these older needles that are existing right in here? Okay, if I want, and by all measurable purposes, I do want growth along this area, and I'm going to show this to Ricardo here, okay? So I want some back budding and branches coming off of this. This is what fills in this big hole that's here that we talk about, don't you want more needle mass? Yes, I just want it in here, not out here, okay? If I want buds in here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave some of these laterally occurring pieces and take off these vertical guys, and just simply by making that delineation, I have a much higher likelihood of getting bud production from the crotch of that needle right there than I would had I taken those off. Now that is not to say if I fully remove those, I couldn't get bud production back on that branch. But I have a higher likelihood by leaving them in those strategic locations because there is adventitious tissue in the crotch of each of those needles. Okay? So this is another way that we can utilize the nature of pines, in particular multi-flush pines, to dictate where the growth is going to occur.
Gary's wondering if it's okay to let 2 to 3 pine cones develop on a Japanese black pine.
I mean, I think, so let's just be really clear about cones and flowers and all of this stuff, because this is a very big question that people ask. Do you want to let a tree flower? Is it okay to have cones on it? Sure, but understand that cones take energy and flowering takes energy, right? That is a fruiting body just the same as an apple or a pear or a plum. And so if you leave them, right, it's going to take energy from the system. If you've got energy to spare, no problem. If you don't, take them off.
Chris is wondering when in the development of the candle is it too soon to decandle, and is there a candle size that you won't cut?
So this is a very interesting question, and Chris, I'm glad that you asked that because there is a point in the development of the candle where it's too soon to take it off, and if you take it off at that point, you'll actually get juvenile growth on a pine tree. Have you guys ever seen juvenile growth on a black pine? It elongates very rapidly. It has big, ugly, scaly looking needles, and from that needle you get one pair. So you get this really dysfunctional looking growth, and that is juvenile growth. In general, the tree's cutting its losses, right? It's saying, gosh, you ruined my growing tip before I had any of these adventitious buds set up at the base to be able to replace it. And this is the best I can do as a branch that has far fewer needles and far poorer of a structure, but we're going to do it anyways. So yeah, there is a time when you can remove them too soon. And generally, we're looking at that point in time being, well, that bud is still extremely soft and green, right? Before it's elongated at all.
And then if you did major structural wiring and bending on a Japanese black pine, would you hold off decandling this year?
Depends on how the tree responds, right? Everything is dictated. When you guys are handling bonsai trees, when you're handling bonsai, everything is dictated by the tree. What is the tree giving you, right? We talked about this the first class. This will just show me how invested you guys are. When a tree grows, what is it saying to you? There we go. I have enough to sustain and add. I have enough to sustain and add. That is kick-ass, man. So cool. I love you guys. Okay? I have enough to sustain and add, right? So when we start looking at, is the tree growing? Is that growth strong? Is that tree showing you all signs and indicators that it has the ability to endure that operation? That is your guideline. That is what we reference. Yes, we can do this. No, we can't. If in doubt, always go past in terms of health and growth and pull back. Never respond to a bonsai out of panic that you can't get back what you had, right? That is the common mistake of beginners. I don't want it to grow too much because I don't know how to get it back to where it was, and I want to keep it here, and it looks so good, and I bought this, and it's expensive, and crap, I'm not going to see the instructor for enough time, right? All of those are great ways to not set yourself back a year, but set yourself back 3 to 5 years, right? And what you always recognize in that situation is, all I had to do was wait. All I had to do was wait. Because I could have gotten it back, it would have been healthier, it would have been easier, it would have been better, but I didn't, and now I gotta wait 5 years for this thing to grow to something of what it once was, right? If in doubt, wait, okay? You guys see the density that we have here now? Okay, now in doing that, I've just basically said every single one of these shoots is now transpiring at the same rate. Therefore, it's getting the same amount of nutrition delivered. Therefore, the candles that are going to be produced are going to be far more uniform in length than they originally were, where we had big, strong ones here, we had smaller ones here, and we virtually had no candles back here. And this is how we approach multi-flush pines to utilize the fact that the strength originates in the roots, that we're dictating the transition of that strength from the roots to the foliage mass by the number of needles we leave, and we're getting rid of all of those candles at the same time because it's too confusing in any other way, and this is actually the best way to balance the strength on your multi-flush pines.
So okay? Is there a candle too small to cut, or you just cut them all?
No, and in fact, candles that don't even grow that spring, right? Because sometimes on a multi-flush pine, you'll just have this little bud sitting here and it'll never grow. You can come in at this time, just poke it with your scissors, and that'll produce an entirely new flush of candles. There was a tree in Mr. Kimura's garden, very famous black pine, never produced more than 25% of the shoots that it had buds for in the spring season. So of course, right, the unlucky apprentice got that tree in the candle pruning process, and you were sitting there going in with each thing and you were poking all of these buds that hadn't grown. But then if you did it correctly, the second flush, all of those flushed out, and that was what gave you your tree. And it was just a characteristic, a nuance of that tree. It was a finicky one. It didn't like to get out of bed early in the spring. Came around right when that summer heat hit, and that was what stimulated all of that growth, okay? But you can even out that strength and reconcile some of those issues by this process if you understand why. Got it?
What are some other multi-flush pines that would apply?
Yeah. So we're talking about Japanese black pine.
Okay.
Japanese
Austrian black pine.
Austrian black pine will not dependably give you a second flush that fully matures in that same season, and that's why it doesn't qualify. It will do sometimes, but it will not dependably do it every single time. And so you can't recommend a technique that does not give you proven results, right?
Okay, so we're talking JBP.
JBP, Japanese red pine, pitch pine, Virginia pine, these are natives. If you go down to Florida, or you go down to Alabama, or some of those, you've got a spruce pine, you've got a loblolly pine, you've got a long needle pine. All of those will produce multiple flushes of growth in a single season. Monterey pine is more like a single flush, although I have heard of people having success in the multi-flush realm, but I can't speak to that. I don't have any experience with that, so I can't. It could be like the Austrian black pine, where people say, well, you can prune it, and I get it sometimes, but not others. I feel like the Monterey pine might be like that, but I don't know. Possibly. Okay?
Tom says if you have consistent, short, beautiful candles all over the tree, do you still decandle?
It depends, Tom. How long are those candles? Are they out of proportion? Are you getting long internodes? Are you going to have long needles? Because if you're not, great. Mr. Kimura used to always say, this is very interesting, if you wanted to win the Kokufu prize with a black pine, you shouldn't candle prune it that year. But that's assuming you could control water and nutrition enough to keep the internodes short and the needle length short. Because that first flush is always going to be your most beautiful flush of growth, right? When we start to look at the candle and the foliage mass that first piece of growth produces, nothing will be more beautiful than that, right? Now, whether or not that's possible becomes the question. Because black pine cultivated as bonsai tend to have so much strength built up that that's never a possibility. It's always too coarse, okay? So I would say, depends on the tree, Tom. All right? You guys have any questions? So Scott's got one over here, Greg. So I just want to recap for you guys strength perpetuation or growth perpetuation. We're talking about growth perpetuation in terms of supplementing the utilization of all of the stored strength that at this point in the season is now run out of the tree. Okay, it's all gone. So we're fertilizing, and we've been fertilizing to continue to draw out the perpetuation of that strength so we can continue to refine our trees. Okay? The feeding that we do now, because we're entering a warmer time of year, we don't want to be competing with water uptake in the heat of summer. We're going to dub down the quantity that we're applying right now. Okay? When we handle our elongating species, we're getting towards the end of their growth for the season. We can come back and prune to a bud down to 2 pairs and set that up and not have to touch that again this year. With our broadleaf evergreens and our deciduous trees, partial defoliation, reduction to 1 or 2 pieces of growth, and we can have that growth to get a finer second flush of growth. Very important technique to understand. Multi-flush pines, over the course of the next month, you guys will be pruning your multi-flush pines. I encourage you to fully decandle, pluck down to 10 to 12 pairs per shoot, and this is going to set you up to have a flush of growth, second flush of growth that gives you a really nice even distribution of strength. Okay? Did we do it? Scott, what do you got?
I think I might have missed it if you talked about it, but it appears that this is a black pine grafted onto a ponderosa, which would mean you've converted it from a multi-flush to a single flush, and it also appears that you have some new grafts on there, which is what we're not actually talking about.
How keen you are.
How would that affect what you're doing, the whole entire process? 'Cause
Yeah.
you have a lot of things going on in this.
Yeah, a lot of things going on. So it's actually the opposite. This is a single flush pine that we're turning into a multi-flush pine, right? Which is to say, when we start talking about our native species of ponderosa, this is one of the only species of pine that I've seen that has a root system as strong as a Japanese black pine, or what I would actually consider to be slightly stronger than a black pine. What that means is, even though it's genetically designed to produce 1 flush of growth in a season, it does have the strength and it does have the, I would say, regional diversity to handle a longer growing season that can accommodate multiple flushes. Bark matches, strength matches, that's a great compatibility that allows us to get a shorter needle and a different species of tree on this wonderfully tortured trunk. This branch here, we didn't try to graft on it because we were going to remove it originally. I now recognize this needs to be a part of the tree. We still have ponderosa on it. These are all grafts that were placed in the fall. Even by doing this work up here and taking the apical dominance out of it, I am pushing more strength into these bottom branches and potentially increasing the likelihood that those grafts will take.
Let's show the live stream.
Now the question is, when will I see those grafts take? And we'll start to see those grafts take when we see this tape naturally starting to split. Now on the live stream, you guys will be able to see that wax tape splitting right there. That's a combination of sun degradation with swelling or increasing thickness of the tissue. When you get increasing thickness of the tissue, that's going to push that wax apart. That's saying growth growth says graft is taking. I'm guessing that this graft is a definitive take. I don't know on these two quite yet. Okay? All right?
Greg is wondering, because of this long cascading branch on this particular black pine, will you leave more needles on the descending branch, or what's your design sort of vision
so
for this tree?
once these grafts take, this ponderosa foliage and this ponderosa foliage come off, and my branch will start from here. Now, whether I choose to grow that longer or whether I choose to keep that nice and tight and compact, that'll be a decision that I'll have to make once we've removed it and we see how the rest of the design of the tree is coming. One thing about design, and what we're doing here at BSOP, what we're trying to establish is a fundamental cycle of bonsai approach, right? What are we doing over the next month? Next month, we're going to talk about what we're going to be doing over July. In July, we're going to be talking about what we do over August, right? This is the fundamental backbone of what we're doing here, okay? But we're not talking a lot about design, because design in terms of how all of this function only gets decided once these grafts take. If they don't take, then it's a moot point, right? I'll have to regraft, and this will be in a different place, and that means this will have a different idea, and I'll be 2 years older, and my bonsai approach and my design might be totally different, right? At that moment, at that time, that is design.
Joe from Alabama is wondering if you could ever force a multi-flush from a single flush pine.
You have to have the genetics of the foliar mass to respond to the pruning, Joe, and a single flush doesn't have that. That's the difference. Black pine has those buds set up. Red pine has those buds set up. Ponderosa pine does not, right? Japanese white pine does not.
What about Scots and Mugo?
Scots and Mugo do not. They don't. They're single flush pines. If you remove that growth, that tip is typically dead, okay? So you can't put those latent buds where you want them on a tree that doesn't have them, okay?
Cool.
Yeah.
Does the ponderosa pine have the vascular system to support the black pine? And I'm talking about down the road. Do all pines, can you just say they're going to match together and they won't grow apart? And
You got to speak into the...
Gotta speak in the mic.
Sorry. As the tree grows, will the new tissue be able to survive off of the old tissue 20, 40, 50 years down the line? Are they going to separate from each other?
Might want to repeat that question.
So the question is grafting in the nature that we're grafting in 40 or 50 years, will the vascular system still be compatible? And that's a really interesting question that you asked, because this is going to go into super bonsai geekery, so everybody buckle up. In Japan, there's a species of white pine called Koko Noe, and they graft Koko Noe either onto black pine base or white pine base. After 50 years, almost inevitably, Koko Noe's graft will fail. One of the two will grow faster than the other, and they'll blow apart, right? As far as we know, for Japanese black pine grafted onto ponderosa pine over the short time that we've been doing it, it holds together and their vascular systems continue to be compatible. 50 years from now, we're definitely going to know enough to be like, screwed up big time on that one. Or, whoo, she worked out, right? It's hard to say right now. It's really hard to say. All signs point to the fact that it gets better, not worse.
Are there any signs that would tell you that that's not a good idea to try?
Absolutely. If you saw one portion of that graft union thickening exponentially greater than the other, you would be looking at a situation that over the course of 20, 30, 40 years, one would be underwhelmed, one would be overwhelming, and they would fail. And that's what happens with the Koko Noe grafts. Exactly. So as these grafts take, so you guys right now probably aren't aware of the fact that the graft for this piece occurred right here. You can't even hardly see it anymore, right?
How long ago did that?
It was a very effective graft. I'm guessing that graft was 3 years ago, maybe 4. So on the live stream, it's this kind of, can kind of see this caramely site.
Chris is wondering if you approach grafted or
no, we just did a scion bud graft. Yep. So what that's telling me, just in the meshing of those two unions, that's a really compatible mixture and match, right? Okay, now, but time will tell. Time will tell with everything that we practice in bonsai, right? The beautiful thing about what we're doing here now is you guys are already, what, I'm going to say, 50 plus years into bonsai being practiced in the United States, reaping the benefits of over, let's just say, 100 years of modern bonsai being practiced in Japan, if we start to look at the use of wire being around the early 1920s. So, boy, what a good time to be doing bonsai, right? Imagine being in the 1920s and being like, is this going to work? Shoot, right? Okay.
Frank was wondering about pollen cones this time of year. What can be done about them?
There's nothing you can do to stop pollen cones from forming, right? The only thing you can do is remove them. And in my experience, removing them causes more damage than leaving them and letting them run their course. And there's no, pollen cones form on a tree that's excessively vigorous or excessively stressed. That's all I got. That's all I got. I would leave them.
That's a big range.
I would leave them. Well, but what I'm saying, it's either super happy or super sad.
And
it's
then,
either trying to survive or trying to reproduce because it's like, I got the genes, baby.
He's wondering what can be done about the resulting long internodes.
Nothing. Well, if it's a multi-flush pine, you can decandle. If it's single flush pine, chances are, if it's flowering because it's excessively vigorous, which tells me it probably is because you're getting long internodes, what that says to me is there'll be buds occurring at the base of that elongating piece of growth. So wait for those before you do anything. It won't happen maybe this year, but it will definitely happen next year. You'll be able to recover from that, I promise. Maybe that'll be something we'll stream about in the future.
And then we kind of had a tree switch up before we came here, but we did mention we would share with everybody what they should be doing with junipers. Junipers.
What should you guys be doing with junipers? I heard Todd gave you a lecture on this last month. What do you say? Don't touch.
Don't do anything.
Don't touch. Don't touch. Now, this is a quantifiable problem, right? Right now, juniper's moving so much energy. Cambial layer easily separates from the heartwood or the xylem that's moving all of that moisture. Bad time to be styling. Big bins, lots of wiring, not a good time, okay? But if we're in, say, Southern California or Texas or Florida, we can't not touch our junipers right now because the growth may be this long in those really warm winter areas. So this could be your first chance to prune in very warm areas. For us in the northern portion of the northern hemisphere, we're going to be waiting until their growth tapers down at the end of the spring or middle of summer to be doing that pruning and clean out, okay?
Yeah, we have a big juniper stream next week.
We do have a big juniper stream next week of a technique that I'm not going to dive into with you guys here because it could cause an explosion of conversation. If you want to see it, tune into Mirai Live, okay?
And then 2 weeks from now, we dive deeper into multi-flush.
So 2 weeks from now, that's right. This is scratching the surface of multi-flush pines as an application and technique in bonsai. If you guys want to know more about multi-flush pines, 2 weeks from now, first stream in June, it's going to be our multi-flush pine stream where we're going to go into fertilization, timing. We're going to go into needle plucking and more advanced, candle pruning more advanced, shaping as we do it. I want you guys to understand that everything we're covering here is giving you an entry point into this next month's activity. There's so much more. It's impossible to cover it up here, okay? Yes, so Alan there. Lee, you want to ask your question first? Okay.
Is this a good time to repot junipers?
I would say that we're a little late, and here's why. Okay. Anytime a plant produces a new piece of growth that doesn't have a cuticle, it's rapidly transpiring and losing water. When you repot, the roots that you're removing are the roots that take in moisture. So that's a particularly sensitive time to be handling the roots of a juniper. I would say we're just a little bit late. But if you have success with it, and this has proven to be a good time for you, I wouldn't argue with you. What do you got, Lee?
Well, you mentioned the pollen cones, and we all know on the ponderosas they really can impede that candle.
Sure.
Same thing. You don't take them, or you do.
My experience personally has been that I do more damage than good, and so I don't take them off. I've also not seen it do any good. I've never seen it stop the elongation of the candle to remove the pollen cones. Once they're there, they're there. There's nothing you can do about it, so I don't. If your experience with pollen cones is different, then I would say trust what you've done and had success with. I have not personally had success with that. Is that fair?
You bet.
Cool.
Thanks.
Hey, thank you guys very much for being here tonight. It's always a pleasure to come back to BSOP. You're amazing. Very much appreciate it. You guys are, world famous now, so it's very exciting. BSOP has been a tremendous club. Everybody joining us from around the world, thank you guys very much for being with us. We love you. We appreciate your support. Happy Super Tuesday. Happy spring. Happy bonsaiing. We'll see you next month. We'll see you guys next week. All right. Have a good night, you guys.